measures. I'm just going to let borrowing go along this path. I'm going to allow the underlying changes and the policy measures announced since March to push borrowing up. And you can see that would be quite a substantial increase in borrowing. The difference between the March forecast and that pre-autumn statement forecast in the current financial year is about £80 billion. And in the last year, in 26-27, it's running at about £90 billion. So let's look at that increase in borrowing. That's shown by these dots on this chart. This is the increase that would have happened had Jeremy Hunt not done anything yesterday. And we can answer the question, how much has he decided to try and offset that increase in borrowing with new spending cuts or new tax rises? And that's shown by these bars. And the answer for the current Parliament is he's really not trying to do very much to offset that increase in borrowing. There could be good economic reasons for that, but when Ken Clarke in 1993 was trying to fix the public finances, our calculations suggest that he went for an approach that was roughly 50-50 tax rises and spending cuts, so one that was more tax heavy than what Jeremy Hunt is now trying to do. So where does this leave tax? Where does this leave taxes as a share of national income? In time, you can see that they were set to rise and reach levels that we hadn't actually sustained since the 1950s. After the mini budget, Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng was still seeing tax as a share of national income at pretty high levels by UK standards, but he had them on a downwards path because of that big package of tax cuts that he announced in his mini budget. Jeremy Hunt is much more than the reverse to that. The new tax rises means that the taxes as a share of national income are set to grow well above what was expected even in March and be well above anything that the UK economy has sustained in its history. So taxes as a share of national income, high by UK historical standards. It's worth saying that there are other successful economies in Western Europe and Scandinavia that sustain higher tax burdens than this. So government borrowing up in the near term, where does this leave the path for government debt? Well, back in March, when Rishi Sunak was Chancellor, he wanted to have debt falling as a share of GDP 3 years out. And he set out some forecasts that showed that this was going to be achieved, but only just. He didn't really have debt on a decisively falling path. Assume that each April, the rate of fuel duties will go up in line with the RPI. And that hasn't happened since 2011. Moreover, they assumed that the 5p cut to fuel duty that's currently in place will be allowed to expire in April. So if that all goes ahead, that implies that fuel duties would go up by a whopping 23% in April. I predict that's not going to happen. If we freeze rates again, it will cost about £6 billion in 23-24. As Stuart will talk about, we've also decided to freeze many allowances in the tax system, and in particular, the personal, whether that's credible. In my lifetime, the maximum freeze that we have managed is 2 years. So it'll be interesting to see whether a 6-year freeze really does happen. So to conclude, there's been a big deterioration in the outlook for the public finances since March due to a much weaker economic outlook. And much of that deterioration is actually explained by higher interest rates pushing up debt interest spending. And actually that increase in debt interest spending could be smaller than what the OBR expects. There is some room for optimism there, I think. The measures outlined by Jeremy Hunt in the autumn statement only counteract a small share of that deterioration in the public finances. And of the measures he set out, we reckon that tax rises are explaining about 40% of the tightening, spending cuts about 60%. There are risks to this. Some of the policy risks are, will taxes as a share of national income really be sustained at 37% of national income? There's also risks on the spending side. Yesterday, Jeremy Hunt trimmed his plan. There's also risks on the spending side, £30 billion. That raises the question of whether the spending plans can really be kept to. And that's something that Ben Zaranko will now address in his presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Carl. Good morning, everybody. The next election. So the starting point for the short-term outlook is that at last year's spending review held last October, the government set out 3 years of detailed department-by-department funding settlements. Those run for the 3 years up until 2024-25. Now, they're fixed in cash terms. That means they don't automatically adjust if inflation or pay awards differ from what was initially assumed. The cash budget has to take that into account. Now, despite what we might have expected and given what's happening to headline consumer inflation, the overall generosity of those plans hasn't actually shifted much on paper. So just to illustrate that, if we look on the left-hand side here, I'm going to show you average real terms growth over the 5-year Parliament. The green bar is what was planned for the last year's spending review. The blue bar is what is now implied based on yesterday's plans for overall day-to-day departmental spending. So stripping out investment, this is for spending on things like staff and day-to-day running. See, very similar. And if we just look at the 3 years covered by the spending review period, again, very, very similar, if anything, a slightly faster growth rate. Now, that's puzzling given what we keep hearing about, including our own use for such calculations is called the GDP deflator. It's a measure of economy-wide domestic inflation. That's going to be higher in the short term, but not that much higher, and actually is forecast by the OBR to be lower in the medium term. So let me show you that. Green bars here, imported food and imported energy and imported fuel. Because the GDP deflator measures domestic inflation, those don't feature. And there's also some impacts from unwinding lockdown effects on public services. Then in the medium term, weak consumer price inflation and consumer demand combined with slower growth in the government part of consumption holds that down. And that's why you've got this very low, below 1% rate of inflation in the later years of the forecast. So those lower rates of inflation flatter the real terms growth in the government spending plans. There are very good reasons to think that that measure of inflation, while perhaps the best one we have, isn't going to perfectly capture cost pressures on public services. There are particular challenges around pay awards. So the GDP deflator next year is expected to be about 3%, CPI about 5.5%. So if government departments offer an inflation matching pay award to their workers, that's clearly going to exceed the cost pressures that would be suggested if you just looked at the GDP deflator. And pay is going to be a very difficult policy area. It's extremely hard to see how you could have pay awards matching inflation or indeed real terms pay rises for public sector workers without either cutting back on headcount or cutting back severely on some other area that will determine service quality. There was also some extra money yesterday. There was extra money for the NHS and for schools, a couple of billion each. And there was quite a bit of extra money for local government. And it's not very often a squeeze from inflation. The OBR estimate that squeeze might be between 5 and 15 billion over the spending review period, depending on how you measure it. That's clearly going to be very difficult for other budgets to absorb. There's also a final thing, which is that big underspends last year by departments lower the starting point, they lower the baseline. So increases relative to a lower baseline, those percentages look larger. So altogether, the overall generosity on paper hasn't changed much. Pay decisions look very difficult. There might be good reasons decisions look very difficult suggested by the official figures. And if you're not schools, local government or the NHS, you're being asked to squeeze your budget, and that's going to be painful. Then after 2025, there were some cuts to the government's plans for spending. So that you can see that here. You can see on the left-hand side, the extra money there for the NHS and social care and schools, but you can see on the right-hand side, reductions in planned spending. Now you can see the yellow bar there is the cut in what was penciled in for aid spending. The government originally was planning for aid to return to 0.7% of GDP. It will now be held at 0.5% of GDP. One quirk yesterday was while the chancellor dropped and changed his headline fiscal rules, he left his original fiscal rules as the thing that will determine when aid goes back to 0.7% of national income. We still have to be running a current budget surplus for that to happen, which is not expected to happen over the entire forecast period. So how did they manage that? Well, they actually just basically tweaked the spending assumption that is applied beyond 2025. So previously, average day-to-day departmental funding was set to grow by more than 3% per year above inflation. That's now 1%. But a 1% increase on average, when combined with increases for some areas, is probably going to mean cuts for other less fortunate, what we might call unprotected budgets. So the OBR provided some useful analysis of this yesterday. They showed that if the overall day-to-day budget rises by 1% per year, You give the NHS 3.1%, which is what it was intended to get over the this 5-year parliament. You keep per pupil funding in schools flat, but because pupil numbers are set to fall, it means you could reduce overall school spending by a bit. You hold defence and aid spending constant as a fraction of national income. You're left, look at that red bar, cutting everything else by about 0.7% per year if you want to stay within those plans. So that's one reasonable guess or estimate of what those plans might imply for public services. Now, that's not the only one. We can alternative scenarios, in particular scenarios where the government provides extra funding. So let's consider a different set of assumptions. Maybe the NHS grows at more like its long run average rate, so more like 3.8% rather than 3.1. Perhaps that would better allow the NHS to deal with the substantial pandemic pressures, post-pandemic pressures it's facing, the number of COVID patients it has, the scale of waiting lists, for example, and to put in place a long-term workforce plan and maybe offer some slightly more generous pay awards. Let's assume that overall schools funding remains flat. So rather than falling in line with pupil numbers, you've still got to have the same number of classrooms and schools in the short term. So it might be difficult to cut spending. Defence, let's instead assume that it rises towards 2.5% of GDP. That's more in line with what Boris Johnson and Liz Truss had committed to, and actually more in line with what Jeremy Hunt promised when he was running to be Prime Minister a few short years ago. And if we hold aid constant as a fraction of national income and freeze everything else, avoid making cuts, well, if you didn't find 17 billion extra and you wanted to do all those things, you'd have to cut those unprotected budgets by about 3% per year. Now, 17 billion pounds in the scale of gets topped up by about 3.7%. If history repeats itself, that will be about 18 billion pounds extra by the end of the period, very similar to the 17 billion I showed you on the previous slide. So you might think of that as a sort of reasonable estimate of what might get added to spending plans. And that combined with, for example, freezing fuel duty would take the Chancellor further away from delivering on his fiscal objectives. Now, turning to capital or investment spending, again, it was a sort of a game of two halves. In the short term, the Chancellor stuck to his existing plans, but then after 2025, he penciled in a cash terms freeze. Now, a cash terms freeze, when inflation is positive and rising, and when the economy is growing, means that investment will fall in real terms and fall as a fraction of national income. So showing here how public sector investment has evolved over time and what it looks like over the forecast period, you can see that it's set to be still above where it's been for most of the past 40 years, still above 2% of GDP, though you can see lower than it would have been under pre-autumn statement plans, about 15 billion lower in the final year. The challenge is that the Chancellor has said his three priorities will be energy, innovation and infrastructure. But if you protect those budgets, if you protect, for example, investments in energy infrastructure and research funding and transport and digital, because those things are all important, well, if overall spending is falling, does that mean a squeeze on other things? Does that mean, for example, a squeeze on the capital budget for the NHS or the prison system or the further education system? There might still be difficult choices to be made here, even though overall investment spending will remain at what is a fairly high level, at least by UK standards. So to sum up, there's some extra money in the short term for schools, NHS and local governments. That undoubtedly will be welcome. Other less fortunate public services will have to absorb cost pressures from higher inflation. There will still be some very difficult choices about public sector pay, sticking to those cash spending plans like the NHS, but there's still a potential disconnect between the funding available and what they're being asked to deliver. The extra cash for the NHS, for example, came with a list of additional asks in terms of what it's going to do about ambulance waiting times and urgent care and things like that. And so there's a danger here, particularly with the substantial cost pressures departments are facing, is that the funding available isn't enough still to deliver on the government's public service objectives. And after 2025, the plans look, in our judgment, implausibly tight. The hope is clearly that they'll never have to be implemented, or at least someone else will have to implement them. And that has to cast some doubt on the credibility of the overall public finance forecasts. That's all from me. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Ben. Good morning, everyone. So let me share my screen. Hopefully you can all see that. So I'm going to talk through the biggest changes to personal and business taxation that the Chancellor announced yesterday, starting with changes to income tax and national insurance thresholds. Now, the thresholds for income tax and employee national insurance are already being frozen for 4 years. Yesterday, that was extended for a now the threshold for employers' national insurance hadn't been frozen. That's now being frozen until the same point as well. And the Chancellor reduced the point at which you start paying the 45% additional rate of income tax from £150,000 to £125,000 to £125,000. Because once your income exceeds £100,000, your personal allowance gets withdrawn, creating an effective 60% income tax band above £100,000. £125,140 is where that tax band ends, so you'll now go straight from that into the 45% band. And that final change will increase the number of additional rate taxpayers by about £350,000. So just the increase from yesterday's announcement is more than the total number of additional rate taxpayers that there were when the additional rate was first introduced. And this just is coming on top of a long line of freezes. Now, it's now the case that essentially every significant threshold in the income tax and national insurance system is being frozen over a long time, hugely on what inflation turns out to be. It's an accidental and arbitrary outcome of that, rather than being the result of a deliberate policy choice. So just to take an example, the original 4-year freeze to income tax thresholds had been due to raise £8 billion when it was first announced. By the summer, we thought that was on course to raise more like £30 billion, almost 4 times as much. Inflation expectations are now a bit lower, so that's now down to £24 billion, although there are now additional freezes on top. You can see it just goes up and down according to what inflation turns out to be, and clearly we can have no idea what that'll be 3 or 4 years down the line. So what do these changes mean for people's incomes? So this shows how people's net take-home pay after tax will change according to their level of earnings. And this first yellow line shows what it looked like before the autumn statement, the changes that we already knew about. If we add in the changes that were announced yesterday, you see the tax rises for pretty much all income levels have got bigger. Taxpayers and the number of people in higher tax bands. So this shows how the number of higher and additional rate taxpayers has changed over the years. By the end of these freezes, we reckon almost 15% of the adult population will be paying higher rate tax. That's up from 8% just a couple of years ago, and under 4% in 1990 when individual taxation was first introduced. And there'll actually be 2 million people just above the £100,000 threshold, and therefore facing above the £100,000 threshold than there were higher rate taxpayers in total in 1990. Turning to council tax, the Chancellor announced that councils would be allowed to increase their council tax by up to 5% a year for the next 5 years. That's up from a limit of 3% this year. The OBR reckons that by the end of the 5 years, that'll be raising almost £5 billion a year more for councils. Now, that's assuming that councils essentially take up their freedom to increase council tax rates in full. This chart shows that if they do that, rather than, say, increasing it by 3% a year, that would increase council tax bills by about £160 a year on average, and would leave us on course to have the highest ever real terms council tax bills. Now, actually, that might not be that surprising. We might expect council tax to rise in real terms. We might expect it to keep. The government is devoting £1.7 billion to ensure that those whose tax bills go up as a result of having their property revalued will see the bills rise only gradually, whereas those whose bills would fall can see it fall immediately. The Chancellor also announced two other cuts to business rates. It wasn't just a tax-raising autumn statement yesterday. First was a 6% real-term cut to business rates across the board. So if I show you now, the tax payable as a percentage of property value, it reduces it from this light green line to the darker line. So for a typical business with a rateable value of, say, £20,000 or £30,000, that'll be worth a few £100s a year off their business rates bill. The other cut to business rates was more specific. It was a 75% reduction for retail, hospitality and leisure businesses for 1 year only. So that one will be worth more like thousands of pounds rather than hundreds of pounds for a typical qualifying business. Now that's supposed to be for 1 year only. It's coming on the back of a history of a series of other reliefs like this, but actually it's even more generous than the 50% relief the aftermath of the pandemic. It's quite hard to see what the for another huge, even bigger relief for retail for 1 year only. But given the history of this, it must be doubtful whether it really will be for 1 year only. And the more people believe that this is going to be permanent or keep being repeated, the less effective it'll be at supporting the sector, because the more we'll tend to see rents on these properties, which I think is very good that they're not doing that. But they just seem to be responding by saying, well, we'll have ad hoc reductions and adjustments to business rates here and there whenever we think it's needed or suitable. That's not really an adequate solution. We need a better vision for what business rates should be doing. The other big announcement on business taxation was, of course, extensions to the windfall tax on the energy sector. So this shows, first of all, the standard rate of corporation tax in the UK and how it's changed over time. Profits from North Sea oil and gas have always been subject to higher tax rates than this. The energy profits levy that was announced in May said that rather than the tax rate for profits on oil and gas continuing at that level, it would go up to an effective rate of 65% for up to 3.5 years. Yesterday, the Chancellor announced that the rate would be higher and that it would last for longer. And this almost doubled the revenue that he expects to get from it. Of course, again, very uncertain, depends on what happens to oil and gas prices and therefore the profits from these companies. This is a pretty substantial, if temporary, tax increase. They're really just taking tax rates on oil and gas profits to around the levels that they've been for, well, much of the previous 40 or 50 years. The windfall tax was also extended in another way, as well as increasing it for North Sea oil and gas producers. There was a new windfall tax on low carbon electricity generators, which again the Chancellor expects to raise a fairly substantial £14 billion over the 5 years or so that it's. There are also a series of smaller tax reforms that I won't spend much time on. There was a common theme to them of really missed opportunities here. There was a reversal of the cut to stamp duty announced in the mini budget, which I think is a bit of a shame. Of all of the tax cuts in the mini budget, that was one that I would like to have seen kept, at least the broad brush reduction. There was the introduction of vehicle excise duty for electric vehicles. Now, the government badly needs a strategy, a plan for how it's going to tax electric vehicles in the future. Just putting vehicle excise duty on them is not a good plan for how you want to tax them in the long term. And the Chancellor slashed the allowances, the amount of dividends and capital gains that you can receive tax-free. Now, capital gains tax in particular is badly in need of reform. You can argue for capital gains tax in particular is badly in need of reform. The reliefs of business asset disposal relief to allowing for inflation to the way that it operates at death would be higher priorities. Raising Autumn's statement. Some of the biggest tax rises, of course, were only temporary, and there was at least one significant tax cut in amongst the general theme of tax rises. But overall, the Chancellor has broadly opted for a set of what looked like relatively easy revenue raises rather than much needed coherent reform of the system, almost emergency circumstances. So I think I might cut him a bit of slack on this occasion, but I would say I would hope for some more considered reform when the Chancellor has a bit longer to think about the issues and bring forward his plans. At that point, I will stop and hand over to Xiao Wei.
Thanks, Stuart. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the outlook for living standards and government support for the cost of living. The outlook for living standards is frankly quite dire. The OBR forecast and that real household disposable incomes will fall by 7% over the next 2 years. Now, this chart shows the year-on-year change in real household disposable incomes over a long period of time. We see that since 2008, we've seen a number of shocks to real incomes, many more than we've seen in previous decades. But the falls in real income we're expected to see in the next 2 years are far larger still than the shocks in recent history. And indeed, they're the largest falls we've seen since record began. This comes on top of already more than a decade of lost growth since the two levels of real household incomes until after the 2027-28 financial year. Now, the blue line here plots what would have happened to real household disposable income. So compared to a situation in which the government did nothing and there was no energy price guarantee, the median household would save £270 per year as a result of the energy price guarantee. However, even with the guarantee, most households will see a large rise in their energy bills. So the median household will see an increase in their energy bills of £900 compared to today, when there's a 2,500 cap in place and most households have access to this £400 energy rebate. And compared to the last fiscal year, before the energy crisis happened, the median household will see an increase in bills of £1,800. Now, I've said that the median household will see an increase in £900 in bills compared to today. However, there's huge variation in how much energy bills will increase depending on how much energy households use. So this bar here plots the distribution in the increase in energy bills, and we see that 1 in 4 households will see an increase of less than £700, so that's the 25th percentile, whilst more than 1 in 4 households will see an increase of more than £1,200. You see this variation in the increase in energy bills right across the income distribution. So even for the very poorest households, those in the lowest decile of household incomes, 1 in 4 households will face a rise in energy bills of more than £1,150 compared to today. The Chancellor's turning now to ordinary benefits, so not benefits specifically targeted at the cost of living crisis. The Chancellor is committed to uprating most main working age and disability benefits with CPI inflation. So in April next year, they'll go up by 10.1%. Now, this is a big increase, roughly keeping pace with inflation, but it won't make up for the falls in real benefits last year when the benefit uprating failed to keep up with inflation. And as a result, real benefits won't return to their pre-pandemic levels until after April 2024. So I'll talk about this in more detail later. In addition, the Chancellor has announced a one-off uprating of the benefit cap with CPI next year. So the benefit cap affects around 130,000 households as of May 2022. These are mostly large households and those with high housing costs, and it's been frozen in cash terms since April 2016. So the uprating of the cap with inflation is obviously welcome and will come as a big relief to these households, the cap in line with main working age benefits going forward, as we recommended in the Green Budget. And we see clearly that, uprating the cap by 10% next year is a positive change, but in a context when prices have increased by 24%, that still means a big cut in real terms since April 2016. I should note also that although most benefits have been uprated within behind the cost of living, so this chart shows the average benefit entitlement of out-of-work claimants in real terms, excluding the housing element, which, as I said, has been frozen. And you see that because of rising inflation, the real value of benefits fell between 2019 and April 2022. The current uprating is just keeping pace with inflation, so keeping pace with this lower level of benefits. And it won't be until April 2024, when inflation subsides, that real benefit levels actually catch up to their pre-pandemic levels. So the fact that real benefit levels are lagging inflation is one of the reasons that the government's introduced these one-off cost of living grants. Another reason being that lower income households spend more of their money on energy and food, which have gone up steeply in prices. And we see here that on average, abstracting from differences in inflation faced by households, so assuming all households face the same levels of inflation, we see that on average, these cost of living grants have roughly kept real benefits at around pre-pandemic levels. However, this is just the picture on average, and really flat rate grants are not a good substitute for just uprating benefits with current inflation. That's because there's huge variation in how much benefits people get. So in this chart, I'm plotting the number of households receiving different levels of universal credit per month, and you see that there's huge variation. So £900 a year in the cost of living grants will be a huge increase. We've seen, as well as those tax measures that Stuart talked about. Here I'm showing the effect of these policies on households across the income distribution. And we see that before the autumn statement yesterday, there was already a progressive set of policies planned for the next fiscal year compared to the tax and benefit system in November 2021. So at the bottom of the distribution, the changes to the universal credit taper, which make universal credit more generous for in-work households, as well as some indirect tax measures, will boost incomes at the bottom of the distribution, whilst freezes to income tax thresholds would reduce incomes for higher income households. Now, the measures announced yesterday reinforce this progressive pattern, with the cost of living support targeted at low-income households, whilst the rise in employment and the lowering of the additional rate threshold mostly hitting high-income households. The energy price guarantee, the savings from the energy price guarantee are broadly evenly distributed across the distribution, and overall households will gain in cash terms on average, with lower-income households gaining more in cash terms. I want to be very clear that I'm just talking about cash to 2027, 28, after the temporary support expires and after the cost of living crisis subsides, 2 years being the biggest falls in real household income on record. And this is despite another big package of support for households in response to the rising cost of living crisis. Despite the support, the median household will still face a rise of £900 in energy bills compared to today, and £1,800 compared to last year. The cost of living support this time around will be targeted at specific groups. There'll be no universal element, and as such, we can expect some middle income households to really suffer next year. Ordinary benefits, so not benefits related to the cost of living crisis, will be uprated with inflation next year. However, they'll still lag pre-pandemic values in real terms until April 2024. Now, this is part of the reason for the cost of living grants that we're seeing, but as I said, these flat rate grants are really not a good substitute for simply uprating benefits with current levels of inflation. Overall, taking the tax and benefit measures as a whole, we see that these are a progressive set of policies. In the next fiscal year, we'll see the poorest households gain. In the next fiscal year, we'll see the poorest households. And in the long run to 2027, 28, we'll see tax rises across most of the income distribution, with the largest rises taking place.
Spending not a good way to get growth. Cutting spending on education, particularly huge cuts to vocational further education, but also to schools over that period. And note, while school spending is going up over the next period, spending on further education, sixth form vocational education, didn't get a mention yesterday. That will be number 2. Very clearly, Brexit was an economic own goal. There may be other reasons for Brexit, but economically speaking, news indeed, and continues to be bad news, particularly the way that we've done it, the hard type of Brexit that we've had, distancing ourselves from the single market. Obviously, the mini budget of a couple of months ago didn't help, shall we say. In fact, that was another large own goal. Carl, Ben, particular, Stuart, do you have any other big own goals that you might want to suggest? If not, don't worry. That might be enough own goals. He should actually have done if he really wanted to get a bit more growth. Carl, perhaps you'd like to start.
I'm afraid I had to reboot my computer, so I'm only now back. I missed the question.
Growth. What would you do to get some growth?
Well, clearly what we want is sustainable growth. So this is not about trying to just put money into the economy in the short run. It has to be about a set of policies that will increase trend growth over the longer term. So you want to look at serious tax reform, not just tinkering with some tax rates. You want to look at government investment policy. You want to look at education policy. You want to look at immigration policy. You want to look at planning law. Whole set of things I think we know that can be good for growth. Doing them isn't easy, though. There's reasons why previous governments have shied away from them. And even if you do them and get them right, you've got to be prepared to understand that the returns from that will be in the long run. So if you get your education policy right, it's going to be decades before you fully reap all the rewards from that. That's not to say you shouldn't be doing them, but there's no quick fixes here.
Yes, I think it was Ed Conway who wrote only slightly tongue-in-cheek in one of the newspapers recently that if you really want growth, you want to concrete over the countryside and open up the borders to completely free immigration. The point being that there are trade-offs here. My view is that on the whole, we've been on the wrong end of that trade-off. In other words, we've been in favour of things other than growth too much, and not being willing to take some of the costs of growth, like building houses in some people's backyards, building roads close to where some people live.
Pricing and dealing with the fact that fuel duty is going to disappear. Not doing things like thinking about the tax treatment of defined benefit pensions, defined contribution pensions before and their inheritances ahead of time. So those sorts of short-sighted measures. And then on one of the big problems we're facing, as Carl talked about, is this big spike in debt interest spending. Part of that is because as the Bank of England increases its base rate, that leads to much higher spending on interest payments on reserves held at the Bank of England. That's falls out from quantitative easing. And Paul Tucker wrote in our recent Green Budget about how this was foreseeable ahead of time, and had we taken, action a few years ago, we could have headed off that problem, and we might not be facing as big an increase in debt interest. On the NHS, there's lots of moving parts, and it's hard to reach a sort of firm conclusion. So the NHS had said originally they reckoned that they were about 7 billion short. because of cost pressures and pay pressures. Yesterday, they got about 3.3 billion. The NHS have since said that 3.3 billion plus about $1 billion of efficiency savings means that they're more or less compensated. It's worth saying that the extra money comes with additional demands on the NHS in terms of what they're expected to deliver. So I think they look to us like they're maybe ever so slightly worse off in real terms, but they're now saying they can make a bigger efficiency savings, and maybe it sort of adds up. They're certainly doing better than other public services that haven't had any extra cash provided. I think there's a question there about pay and how much extra pay might eat into that money available. As a sort of rule of thumb, this isn't precise, but every extra percent on the NHS pay bill costs maybe 800 million to about maybe to $1 billion. And so if next year, rather than giving 3% pay awards, they give 5% pay awards, you might expect about half of that extra cash to get eaten up. But that's that's back of the envelope. It's not based on any sort of detailed bottom-up analysis.
Brilliant, thank you. Question from Tom Rees of the Telegraph here. Probably some combination of Carl and Xiaowei, I think this is for. Almost half the projected increase in welfare is driven by disability and other benefits linked to long-term sickness. Is this worrying? Well, I think the answer to that is yes. How does the shrinking workforce impact the economy? There's a question there about investment as well, which seems to be rather separate. But the increase in welfare driven by long-term sickness and its impact on the economy. Xiaowei or Carl, would you like to have a shot at that?
I'm happy to have a go. I mean, yes, it's clearly of potential concern. I think really we need to work out the extent to which it's the benefit system doing a better job of how do we get people in a better position, how do we help them manage those health conditions and have better options in their lives. And if it's not that, then clearly we want to be thinking about how can we design the benefit system. So yes, I mean the shrinking workforce. With colleagues have put some work out recently looking at people in the years approaching state pension age, where we've seen a big drop in the proportion who are in work or looking for work, a big increase in the proportion who are economically inactive. We don't think that the increase in the numbers of people moving out of work is because of them being in worse health. We think the increase in poor health is actually occurring amongst people who've been out of the labour market for some time. So there's actually two problems, if you like. There's one is, why are people who've been out of the labour market for a while seem to be getting sicker than they used to? And that's something we certainly need to focus on. And there's a second issue, which is about why are increasing numbers of older people post-pandemic choosing to leave the labour market? And is it...
We do know that people who report long-term sickness are less likely to re-enter the labour market. And we have also seen a decrease in flows out of inactivity that may be due to rising sickness among this already inactive population. So I think that's something we'd need to dig into a little bit more. In terms of the falling labour supply in general, of course, that's going to be bad for the economy and that's going to constrain growth. And actually, relative to the March forecasts, the OBR actually downrated growth due to rising inactivity compared to what was expected in March. However, that was exactly offset by an increase in immigration from outside the EU that they weren't expecting in March. So overall, no effect on labour supply, but the rising inactivity rates are obviously worrying for growth. I think it's particularly worrying in the context of growth in the 2010s. So the OBL had a really interesting chart in the EFO this year that showed that in the period between 2010 and 2019, growth was mainly driven by increasing hours worked. So it's driven by increase in the labour supply, increased hours work of people, in work, as well as increased immigration. With very little growth being driven by capital investment or productivity growth. If you contrast that with growth in the period between the late 90s and before the financial crash, a lot of the growth then was driven by productivity growth as well as capital investment. So rising immigration and potentially falling labour supply, we're really going to have to look at how we can get productivity growing again.
Really important points there from Xiaowei. It's also worth reflecting on the fact that a lot of people on disability and incapacity benefits are now relatively young. This is something which is particularly affecting less well-educated young people, particularly lots of mental health problems in that group, tightening due to the mini budget and Brexit. He says the OBR chair downplayed those. It is true that that gilt rates have sort of gone back largely following the mini budget, but this is one of the other economic own goals, actually, which one of my colleagues has just emailed me to remind me about, which is that the general economic and political instability and uncertainty that we've had over the last several years, which are associated with Brexit and also with that mini budget, have definitely been a constraint on growth. To have 3 prime ministers and 4 chancellors in a few months, and to be reversing policy here, there, and everywhere, to be uncertain about your trading relationship with the rest of Europe, have corporation tax going up, down, and round and round and round. All of that is bad for growth, and that, in some sense, you could say the mini budget was a symptom of that. You could also say it was a cause of that. Clearly, the economy, as the OBR itself has said, is significantly smaller as a result of Brexit, and that clearly makes the fiscal situation more difficult than it otherwise would have been. We've only got a couple of minutes left. Would any of my colleagues like to pick any particular one of the very many questions that are still there that they're really keen to answer? I'll give you 10 seconds to answer that, or I will ask one myself.
There's a question about schools funding, which is quite easy to answer.
That's a good reason for choosing.
Yeah, which is it going in real terms? The answer is yes. So our colleague Luke Sovietis has shown that if you just use a GDP deflator for pupil funding,
they were much bigger than what's now being expected over the next few years. But I think it's also a very different context. In 2010, 2011, Mr. Osborne was trying to do big spending cuts after a period where there'd been big spending increases in lots of areas of government. If we try and do any spending cuts now, it'll be coming off the back of several years of deep spending cuts in lots of areas, and also public services which are having to deal with things like extra responsibilities because of Brexit, extra challenges because of the pandemic. So a much harder era to do, a much harder time to be doing cuts than it was, say, in 2011.
Right, we should stop there. Thank you so much, everyone. I should say, members of the press who have not had their questions answered or have further questions, do feel free to get in touch with me or through with my colleagues or through the press office. I don't mean this meanly. I sincerely hope that we don't see you again at an event like this until after a budget in March. I'll be happy if we have another fiscal analysis at this event. Particular thanks to all of my colleagues who have had very little sleep over the last 24 hours for another fantastic